So it took about 6 minutes to create our Kubernetes cluster. I can say go to resource right on the deployment screen here. And here it is, the overview for our Kubernetes cluster, created exactly as we expected it. Because we had 3 nodes of 2 cores each, that's 6 total cores. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to use the command line to connect to this cluster, because at this point we're going to start interacting with this from the command line. So we're going to use Cloud Shell, this greater than sign underscore, in order to connect with the command line. And in the last demo, we used PowerShell. Why don't we switch over to the Azure CLI to interact with this? Okay, so we're going to use command line here. Now Kubernetes, the tool to connect with it is called kubectl, kube control, kubectl. Before we can call it, though, we do need to connect to this cluster. So we're going to use the AKS command line to connect to the cluster, and we're going to call the get credentials method of that. We have to give it the resource group. This was created in the AZ203 new VM resource group, and yours will be different. And I have to give it the cluster name. We can see even up here the cluster name is SJD new cluster. So this basically sets up my Cloud Shell to have the right context for this cluster. Now we can use kubectl, oops, almost an embarrassing typo, to look at the nodes of the cluster. Remember, we created 3 nodes of 2 CPUs each, and we've got our nodes ready to go here. It's in a ready state. We created it 7 minutes ago. We can sort of see the basics here at the get nodes stage. So next up, we need to get our cluster. We need to deploy some code to it. Now, we can do this by basically having a YAML file. I happen to have an existing YAML file from previous demonstration. I'm going to pull in the Azure web page where this file comes from. Okay, so I took this file from the AKS walkthrough. Now let's break down this YAML file a little bit. This is basically a settings file, and it tells Kubernetes where to get the code to deploy into the cluster. Now this YAML file happens to have 2 types of programs. One is what's called a backend program and a front-end program. So we can see that there is a service that runs as the backend, and if I scroll down a little bit, another service is the front end. So 2 services being deployed into this cluster. Also within this YAML file, it says where it gets the code from. So the backend is actually an instance of Redis. So Redis is a caching program. And so there's no code, it's just Redis. And so Redis has an API, and the front end must use Redis in order to store its results. And if we go down to the front end program, then it's getting the Azure Vote front image in the Microsoft repository. If we switch over to Docker real quick, Docker Hub, we can see that the Microsoft Azure Vote front is an image in the Docker repository. And basically we can use this as an example set of code that we can push into the container. Okay, so this is where it's getting the code from. There's actually no code in the YAML. It's just a backend, which is a Redis service, and the front end comes from Docker Hub. So I'm going to go back to my Cloud Shell, and so we're going to want to deploy this code. The way that you do that is by using kube control, just like you would expect. The command is apply. So we want this Azure vote.yaml file to be applied to these cluster that we've already connected to. And so the file name is Azure Vote. I'm going to hit tab. The tab auto completes it. Azure Vote -f this YAML file. So when I do this, it's going to basically push the deployment and the service to these cluster nodes. Okay. Now, if I want to see, remember we did the get nodes before, and we're not going to see what's actually happening. It's just the nodes are in a ready state. But if we did get service, we can see that the back end and the front end service is being deployed. Now the front end service requires an IP address. So both of them have private IP addresses that are not accessible from the internet. But one of the instances of the front end service does require a public IP address. And so that actually takes a few minutes to provision an IP address. Remember, it's accessible through port 80. So we're going to give this a few minutes for the IP address to be basically requested and provisioned. Now we can see that the front end has been provisioned. There is an IP address. If I opened up my browser and entered this IP address, pulled this across, then this is the code. Remember, it's from the Docker Hub, vote front. This is the code that's been set. Now, presumably, I can vote for cats and dogs, and this gets pushed to the Redis cache as the backend. I can reset it, Redis gets purged, and we can vote for dogs again because dogs are the best. Okay, so pushing code to the cluster is done basically through the command line. I'm going to point something out to you. I'm going to minimize this. If we go to the cluster, the overview is actually fairly simplistic. We're not getting a lot of insights into the cluster. And even if we look along the portal, we don't see that there's a lot of metrics and overview. I mean, we can go into Azure Monitor, I guess, but we're not getting what we would expect. Even for virtual machines, we see more insights into what's happening. There's a thing called Kubernetes Dashboard. Now, Kubernetes Dashboard only runs in your local. It doesn't run in Cloud Shell. And so you need to basically install the command line, do the same thing that we did in terms of getting the credentials, and then we can use the AKS browse command in order to see the Kubernetes dashboard. I'm going to do that in the next video.